Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Whispering Shadows. Holly Arnold stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, her eyes fixed on the crumbling mansion that loomed before her. Its once grand stone facade was mottled with decay, ivy creeping up like skeletal hands across the windows. The heavy, slate-colored clouds above the Isle of Wight had set an ominous tone, and a cold breeze whistled through the tall, unkempt grass surrounding the estate. "Well, it's certainly rustic," Holly's father, David Arnold, said, attempting optimism. He stood beside her with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Holly could sense his unease. Her mother, Lydia, was more cheerful as she unloaded boxes from the car. "It's perfect. Just think of all the character," Lydia chirped. "All this space and history for such a bargain. It's a dream come true." Holly wasn't convinced. The house, known to the locals as Blackwood Manor, had stood empty for decades. The history books spoke of tragedies, strange disappearances, and whispers of hauntings, but her parents had laughed it off, chalking it up to local legends. As they stepped inside, Holly felt the first twinge of dread. The vast entrance hall was cool and damp, and the smell of age clung to everything: the dark oak beams, the faded wallpaper, the cracked marble floors. The atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the house itself was waiting, watching. "We'll make it homey in no time," Lydia said, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. Holly wanted to believe her. She followed her parents up the grand staircase to explore the second floor. The moment her foot hit the landing, she paused, feeling something strange in the air and unsettling stillness. She glanced at the walls. They were lined with tall, arched windows draped in heavy velvet curtains, but what caught her attention were the shadows. They were wrong. The light from outside was weak, but there was enough of it to cast clear shadows on the walls. Yet the shadows seemed too deep, too thick, almost like ink had bled into the fabric of the walls themselves. And then, ever so faintly, she heard it, a soft, rasping whisper. Holly froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What was that?" she whispered to herself, but no one else seemed to hear it. Her parents were busy discussing renovations, their voices a distant hum as Holly focused on the shadows. She could swear they were moving, just slightly, as though something was lurking within them, breathing, waiting. That night, after unpacking, Holly settled into her room, which was larger than any she'd had before, though it felt far too big, far too empty. The walls were lined with the same dark wallpaper that adorned much of the house, with thick shadows stretching across them. She stared at the shadows, her pulse quickening when she noticed the same faint movement from earlier. And then came the whispering again. This time it was unmistakable. Faint like the rustle of fabric, yet clear. A voice, or rather, many voices, soft, insidious, crawling through the silence. Holly, her breath hitched. She sat up in bed, the room colder now, as if the air itself had been drained of warmth. The whisper came again, this time more distinct. Her name. Holly came closer. She turned toward the wall, dread coiling in her stomach. The shadows seemed to swell, growing darker, and the whispers thickened, swelling around her. "Leave us," the voices hissed, each word stretching into a long, eerie cadence. "You are not welcome." Holly clutched the blankets, her eyes wide. Her rational mind screamed that this couldn't be real, that it was just the stress of the move, the old house playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew the house was alive in a way no one wanted to admit. She heard footsteps outside her room, and her mother appeared in the doorway, her face concerned. "Are you okay, sweetie? I thought I heard you talking." Holly hesitated. "I keep hearing voices in the walls." Her mother sighed, her smile forced. "Old houses make a lot of noise, Holly. It's nothing to worry about. Why don't you get some sleep? Tomorrow will be better." Holly nodded, though sleep seemed impossible. That night, as she lay awake, the whispering grew louder. The shadows writhed, as if something inside them was trying to claw its way out. She could hear fragmented phrases now, murmurs of a past filled with pain and secrets. She never left, trapped in the dark, bewailing the light. The next few days were no better. Her parents seemed blissfully unaware, too focused on fixing up the mansion to notice the growing darkness. Holly, however, couldn't escape it. Every room she entered was alive with whispers. The shadows clung to the walls like parasites, speaking of horrors long buried. One evening, Holly ventured into the basement, compelled by a force she didn't fully understand. The air down there was thick and stale, the scent of mold strong. She held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as she descended the stone steps. The shadows here were even thicker, moving like a sea of ink. As she reached the bottom, the whispers swelled, filling her head with their maddening chorus. The words were clearer now, telling her about the people who had once lived here. They were betrayed, murdered. Holly's heart raced as the voices told her of a family, much like hers, who had moved into the house decades ago. They had vanished, leaving no trace. But they hadn't left the house, not entirely. She waits, she watches Holly turn to leave, but something moved in the corner of the basement. The shadows coalesced, forming a figure, a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow black pits. She reached out to Holly, her voice a rasping whisper. "Help us, free us." Holly stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as the figure stepped closer. She could feel the cold radiating from the apparition, hear the mournful cries of the souls trapped in the house. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. Holly screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in, the voices swelling to a deafening roar. They spoke of blood, of betrayal, of a curse that bound them to the house. And now Holly and her family were a part of it. Just as the cold fingers of the shadowy figure brushed her skin, the door burst open, and her father yanked her out of the basement, pulling her into the light. "Are you all right? What were you doing down there?" David's voice was frantic. But Holly couldn't answer. She stared back at the basement, where the shadows writhed and twisted in the doorway, retreating slowly as the light of the hallway poured in. From that night on, Holly knew the truth. The house didn't want them there. The shadows whispered secrets too dark to bear, secrets of a past filled with unspeakable horror. But it wasn't just the past. The house was alive and it was hungry. And it wasn't finished with her yet. Weeks later, as the renovations continued, Holly noticed subtle changes in her parents. They grew distant, distracted, their eyes often glazed over, as though they were listening to something only they could hear. The shadows no longer whispered to Holly alone, they were spreading their dark influence, slowly consuming the family, one secret at a time. Holly knew the whispers wouldn't stop until the house had claimed them all. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion grew colder, its grip tightening around Holly's family. She could feel it, even when her parents seemed unaware. They still went about their days, hammering, painting, and replacing old fixtures, determined to make Blackwood Manor their home. But Holly could see the change in them. The spark that once animated their voices and movements had dimmed, leaving behind hollow echoes of who they were. Her mother, Lydia, spent hours staring out of the windows, her eyes vacant as if entranced by something beyond the glass. Her father was no better. He would disappear into rooms for hours at a time, claiming he was doing repairs, though when Holly looked, nothing seemed to have changed. The house was getting to them, feeding on them, and Holly could do nothing but watch it unfold. The whispering never stopped. At first, it was only at night, but soon Holly began hearing it during the day. Voices were incessant now, tugging at the edge of her mind, unraveling her thoughts. They spoke in riddles, fragments of memories and warnings. "She's coming, do not let her in." They're part of it now. One afternoon, Holly wandered the halls, following the whispers, trying to understand their message. As she turned a corner, she found herself in front of a locked door at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The door was different from the others, older, made of dark wood, with iron hinges that looked as though they hadn't been touched in centuries. The shadows here were thicker, more alive, writhing like snakes along the walls. Holly's heart raced as she approached. The whispers intensified, growing more urgent. "Do not open," she waits. Holly hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron doorknob. She didn't want to open it. Every fiber of her being screamed that this door was different, that something waited behind it, something far worse than the shadows. But she couldn't stop herself. The whispers urged her on, a chorus of voices guiding her. The knob was cold beneath her fingers. She turned it, the door creaking open with an agonizing groan. Inside was a small, forgotten room, dark and filled with dust. But what caught Holly's attention was the object in the center of the room, a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was gilded, intricate designs carved into the gold. The glass, however, was not reflective. It was black, impossibly so, as if the surface absorbed all light that touched it. Holly stepped closer, her breath shallow. The shadows in the room seemed to gather around the mirror, whispering louder now, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. As she stared into the dark surface, something moved, just a flicker, barely noticeable, but enough to freeze her in place. And then she saw it. A face. Pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared back at her from the depths of the mirror. The woman from the basement. Holly gasped, stumbling backward. The woman's lips moved, though no sound came from the glass. Yet Holly could hear her voice in her head, clear as a bell. "Help me!" The word sent a chill down Holly's spine. The woman's hand pressed against the other side of the glass, as though she was trapped inside, pleading for release. Holly shook her head, backing toward the door. "I don't understand." The woman's face twisted, her expression becoming desperate. "They are lost as I was. You must stop her." The shadows around the mirror shifted, dark tendrils reaching out toward Holly. She turned and fled, slamming the door behind her as the whispers followed her down the hall. That night Holly lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The woman in the mirror haunted her thoughts, and the whispers wouldn't let her forget. She had tried to tell her parents, but they dismissed her concerns, brushing it off as the overactive imagination of a stressed teenager. But Holly knew better. Something terrible had happened in this house, and the shadows wouldn't stop until they were all consumed by it. As the hours ticked by, Holly's eyes drifted to the shadows on the wall. They were thicker now, darker, almost alive. The whispers grew louder. Beware the mirror she watches from the dark. Suddenly there was a soft creak. Holly sat up, her heart pounding. Her bedroom door was open, just a crack. She hadn't left it that way. She slid out of bed, moving cautiously toward the door, her skin crawling with the feeling of being watched. As she reached for the door, it swung open slowly, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. Holly's breath caught in her throat. There, at the far end of the hall, stood the woman from the mirror, her pale figure barely visible in the flickering shadows. Her hollow eyes were fixed on Holly, and though her mouth didn't move, her voice filled the hallway. "You must stop her before it's too late." And then, just as suddenly, the figure vanished, swallowed by the darkness. The next day, Holly knew what she had to do. The whispers had told her enough. Something was coming, something ancient and malevolent, and the only way to stop it was to confront the mirror. With her heart in her throat, Holly returned to the locked room, armed with nothing but her resolve. The door opened easily this time, almost as if the house itself was inviting her in. The mirror sat in the center of the room, its surface dark and still. As Holly approached, the shadows in the room seemed to recoil, as though they feared what she was about to do. She stood before the mirror, her reflection swallowed by the blackness. The woman appeared again, her face contorted in fear. "She is coming." Holly steeled herself, her hand reaching toward the mirror. Who's coming?" The woman's eyes widened, and the shadows around the room began to pulse, as if alive. "The one who cursed us all." She, before the woman could finish, the room grew cold, colder than Holly had ever felt before. The shadows thickened, spiraling around the mirror, and Holly felt the presence behind her. Something ancient. Something terrible. Slowly she turned. In the doorway stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its form indistinct, as though it was made of the shadows themselves. Holly's blood ran cold. The whispers swirled around her, frantic now. "She's here, the mistress of shadows." Holly backed away, her hand brushing against the mirror's cold surface. The figure moved toward her, the air around it crackling with malevolent energy. The shadows slithered across the floor, reaching for her, whispering their final warning. "You must destroy the mirror before she takes you." With a surge of desperation, Holly grabbed a nearby candle holder and swung it at the mirror with all her strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards of black glass raining down like ink-stained snow. The figure in the doorway let out a terrible, ear-splitting shriek as the shadows recoiled, pulling away from Holly, retreating into the walls. The house itself seemed to groan, its ancient timbers shuddering as if released from a great weight. And then silence. Holly stood alone in the dark room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The mirror was gone, its hold over the house broken. The shadows, for the first time since they had arrived, were still. But Holly knew the truth. The house had been freed, but the darkness would never truly leave. Somewhere in the forgotten corners of Blackwood Manor, the shadows were waiting whispery, and they would always be watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.